Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. Now it's that time of the year again. Time of the year when I'm inclined to ask big questions, to make grand overviews. Time to step back and ask, what the hell are we doing? Now, in philosophy and honestly in life in general, I think that's always a good question to keep in mind. But nevertheless, let me try to talk about the guiding maxims and the leading hypotheses, or at least my best attempt at selecting the best tools for the job, so to speak. So to speak, the navigational charts and instruments, deliberately using a metaphor of a ship at an open sea, where the success of the journey is unfortunately by no means guaranteed, but we have to try to do our best. And navigation is, of course, not the only skill in the game, and yet a crucial one nonetheless. And would it not be a kind of madness to imagine that one could safely reach the destination with a faulty compass and a map that's upside down? But jokes aside, let's go to work. So let's start somewhere and we'll see how it goes. First of all, philosophy is a project. It's an ongoing process. The history of philosophy teaches us anything, it is that people can be wrong, including the most intellectually sophisticated and brilliant people can get it very, very wrong. It is also a project which is at the same time collective and individual. Philosophy as a human activity has social conditions. Cue my favorite motto as to how thought is linguistic and language is social and therefore historical. A moment's reflection will tell us that we can only really do philosophy together as a matter of biographical fact. After all, human children don't survive on their own. But more importantly, in this modern age, of course, we've all had teachers. And some of them were good and some of them were not so good. As Socrates says to Alcibiades, the first task of education is to unlearn all the harmful and unhelpful things that society has inculcated in us. And though we study together, in dialogue, in a group, in a class, and yet I address my students as individuals. Philosophy, in this sense, is the most private activity. Confronting oneself with the question, what am I doing with my life? It's actually, paradoxically, even more individual than individual, even more private than private. Because deep philosophical reflection pits ourselves against ourselves. We disabuse ourselves of the empty tautology that A is equal to A, that I am myself, that, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. We discover the immensely complex and also, importantly, the conflictual nature of our own psychological internal life. Cogito ergo sum is an empty tautology. What it obscures is the myriad of souls vying for control. Psyche is a battleground between beliefs, values, and desires that pull us in different directions. When we close our eyes and pull our gaze inwards, what we discover is not a harmonious unity, at least not normally. What we discover is the Heraclitean flux, polemos pater panton. We discover war. We discover the palintropos harmonia, the temporary truce between opposing tensions, like that of a drawn bow. We always already find ourselves thrown into this world, thrown as a part of society, but also find ourselves with these competing and conflicting beliefs, values, desires. And then, if we're honest with ourselves, we're forced to confront the question, where do they come from? What is the basis of our beliefs? What is the value of our values? What is the origin? And what is the proper object of our desires? So this is how the inside leads outside. And so we're forced to do science, to study the messy and the faulty and the ever-changing textbooks of physics and biology and maybe evolutionary psychology and books of history, the marvelous slaughter bench with no rhyme or reason, detailing the ruthlessly violent origins of our civilization, the velvet glove of pompous morality and, at times, self-righteous religiosity, the velvet glove that hides the iron fist. So let us take stock, lay out a kind of a manifesto, tentative and provisional, yes, but the one that I urge we take with complete seriousness. So we start with epistemology, as I think we should. Skeptical and fallibilist, because the human mind has a tendency to jump to conclusions and to make mistakes. Psychologist and empiricist, because our access to reality is mediated by the imperfect organs of perception that are at our disposal. Social and constructivist, because the mind is not a neutral medium, not a passive recipient, but because our assumptions and our ways of looking at the world, in a large part, co-determine the kind of picture that we will ultimately get. And these assumptions and ways, again, are deeply and intimately social. And the word truth, this charged and ambitious word, is more of a laurel wreath that we hand out as a sign of social consensus, more as a sign of social consensus, of concord, of agreement, of social agreement, much more than we care to admit. And then there's the problem of circularity, what the holistic approaches to epistemology try to highlight. How our arguments, in the words of Quine, have a form of a closed curve in space, and how our statements about the external world do not subsist independently, but exist as a web of belief, and therefore face the tribunal of sense experience not individually, but only as a corporate body. And it is, I think, very important to disabuse ourselves of facile positivism or falsificationism, the misguided search for simplistic knockdown arguments that, at best, might win one a couple of points in a cheap debate, but have no place in a serious intellectual inquiry. Philosophy is hard work. Knowledge is hard work. Thinking is hard work. No one said it's going to be easy. So let us now move from epistemology to ontology. And there's immediately a jarring contrast between the epistemological skepticism of the method and between the intricate complexity of the conclusions. And I do think that it is very important to hold the balance between the two sides of the tension. If we focus too much on skepticism, there's a temptation to just throw up our arms in despair, to just proclaim Panta estin akatalipta. Nothing can be known, so let's not worry. And on the other side, there's an equal danger of falling too much in love with the tentative conclusions, forgetting that they are only that, tentative conclusions, of getting lost in the magnificent edifice of the modern scientific enterprise, so to speak, from protons to presidents, the presumed unity of science, from physics to chemistry to biology to psychology and social science, to be so impressed by it so as to forget the tentative and hypothetical nature of this magnificent, marvelous edifice. The difficult and challenging task, I think, is to try and straddle the two horses, to hold a balance between overly pessimistic skepticism and overly optimistic dogmatism. And so, keeping this precaution in mind, we proceed forward. And so, in this long scientific revolution, from Thales to Copernicus to Darwin and Turing, we discover the universe which is at bottom radically alien to us, the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter, the landscape of ever-increasing entropy towards no discernible aim or purpose, likely towards the maximum dissipation of all stable structure. towards the heat death. And the biological life, and even humanity itself, simply an accidental byproduct, the froth on the waves. How do we get from protons to presidents? Through a process of blind and mechanistic selection operating on random mutations. And it seems to me that evolution by natural selection, first anticipated by the likes of Empedocles and Anaxagoras, that this mechanism of selection plays the key role in the diachronic process of biological life, as well as the history of language and of cultural forms, and even the biographical history of individual psychology. Notice also how the evolutionary picture yields a systems ontology and a process ontology. Focus not on the stable objects, but on the evolving systems in motion. And thus we come to the most challenging and the most controversial part of our story. The realm of the human, the all too human, fraught with fierce passion, veiled and obscured under the seductive narratives, confusing words and descriptions with the reality, mistaking emotions with arguments. With Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, let us try to disentangle the convoluted genealogy of the tapestry of illusions and ideologies. Try to deconstruct the 15 proverbial lies that we tell ourselves to get out of bed in the morning. What is it that we shall find at the end of the journey between the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect? In the time of anguish, shall we find deliverance from suffering? Find a stable vantage point in the eye of the storm. We who come to the Olympic Games, not to compete, but to observe. Panta rei, let the Heraclitean flux wash over us. Could it be that the solution has already been found by the ancients in the catastematic point of contact between Buddha, Sextus, and Epicurus? The right view of things that once attained promises to yield tranquility, at least while the mental concentration lasts. May we all attain the right view and the right concentration, colleagues. Stay safe and take care.